Today, I'm going to talk about the future of personalized AI, but before I do, I want to start with why I'm here. These are my three kids. This is Luke over here, Jack and Alex. They are the reason I'm here today, and I want to talk about the future I want for them. And I want to warn you before we get started that we are going to together take a trip to Crazy Town. What I'm going to say today might sound crazy the first time you hear it, but I'm going to do my best to bring you all along for the ride and hopefully get us back safely after our trip to Crazy Town. So I'll start with that. You have been warned. So the future of personalized AI. What is personalized AI? I was preparing for this presentation and I came across a video last week that actually answered this question very well. So I thought I'd take a short clip of that video and share it with you because I thought it did such a great job describing what I mean by personalized AI.
If I wanted to ask ChatGPT something right now about something we had talked about earlier, think about what would happen. I would reach down, I would get out my laptop, I'd open it up, I'd launch a web browser, I'd start typing, and I'd have to explain that thing, and I would hit enter, and I would wait, and I would get a response. And that is at the limit of what the current tool of a laptop can do. But I think this technology deserves something much better.
I think he's right. In fact, Brett and I, my co-founder, we took a trip down to the coffee shop, same place Sam went, and we thought about this question, don't we deserve something better? And I think the answer is yes. And the reason why is there's this insight that we've developed along the way, that AI is getting smarter, but still knows very little about you. Let me describe the personalized AI landscape. So here I'm going to graph a few products. On the x-axis here is intelligence. You can imagine models going from dumb to smart over time. And the y-axis is kind of what I'm going to talk about, which is personalization. It's the ability for those models with the right context to deliver amazing results, to do great things for you. So let's talk about this landscape. So it started with the ChatGPT moment when GPT 3.5 came out. I think for the first time, people really realized the power of large language models. And every year, every month, every week, every day since then, it's been this rolling thunder of increased intelligence. GPT-4 came out, GPT-4.5, now we got O3, we got a bunch of models out there. And it's kind of conceivable for the first time in a long time to imagine AGI is just around the corner. This was a pipe dream that a lot of people mocked and scoffed at that folks out there trying to achieve of artificial general intelligence. But I think most people today would agree that this is on the horizon. In some cases, maybe it's already here in some situations. And soon, you're going to hear a lot more about artificial superintelligence, not just general intelligence, but it's machines far greater capable than the average human at tasks that at one point thought were impossible to be solved with AI. So that's the landscape you're probably familiar with. It's models getting smarter and smarter. It's kind of inevitable that the world is going to see these models get smarter. But what I'm going to focus on today is the other dimension, not just the X dimension here, intelligence, but the Y dimension, personalization, using the context to give you amazing results. And in fact, ChatGPT, as much as Sam disparaged it just now, is actually quite good at this. ChatGPT has the capability of saving memories, facts about you, the names of your children perhaps. It also lets you go back on your chat history. If you ask a question of ChatGPT where the history of things you've asked it before are relevant, it's able to do that. But I think, like Sam said, we deserve something better. Wouldn't it be great if you had something in the world today that could capture everything you've said and heard? Introducing the Limitless Pendant. The Limitless Pendant remembers what you say and hear throughout the day. You can stay engaged without the distraction of taking notes, and you get insights about your life. On top of that, of course, you can ask your personalized AI anything. The future is here, it's just not evenly distributed. Many of you in this room are the earliest adopters of the Pendant. You've had a pre-order in for many years, but the vast majority of the world does not yet know the Pendant exists. So today is our official launch of the Limitless Pendant. As many of you know, the battery lasts all day. You get crystal clear audio. It's light and wearable, and it's weatherproof. And many of you, I heard it today, somebody threw it in the laundry, somebody jumped in the pool. It's an amazing device that gives you the context of everything you've said and heard. So that is that product that we hoped to exist, that exists today, that the vast majority of the world has not heard of yet. It is the Limitless Pendant. It helps you capture everything you've heard and everything you've said. So let me give you some concrete examples of what asking your personalized AI anything might look like. And I'll contrast this with where we came from in terms of improved intelligence. So let's give an example of drafting an email to Sam Altman. He's an investor in our company, and so in 3.5, I tried this in ChatGPT. You ask it to draft an email to Sam Altman. It says, I hope this email finds you well. You'll notice AI models really want people to be found well. I don't know what it is about them, but I hope this email finds you well is something you'll see a couple times here. My name is, insert your name, doesn't know who I am, and I'm reaching out to you, and I'm interested in discussing a potential collaboration or partnership. Interesting, doesn't even know who Sam is. That's GPT when it first launched, GPT 3.5. Well, GPT 4 got a little smarter. It knows who Sam is, which makes sense, because Sam is the CEO of OpenAI. It talks about a collaboration, but again, doesn't know who I am, doesn't know where I work, doesn't really give us much details about our relationship. GPT 4.5, with the benefit of ChatGPT and saved memories and chat history, which is the dimension in the personalization axis here, it does quite a bit better. It talks about a collaboration opportunity between Limitless and OpenAI. Hey, notice I work at Limitless. Oh, I feel so special. I hope you're well. It's interesting. Now they hope you're just well. Not the email finds you well, but you're well. That's good too. Okay, I do hope you're well, Sam. I've been following OpenAI's incredible advancements and deeply admire the transformative work you and your team have done. So it talks about the pendant. It's got some great, interesting details. Most of this I got through my chat history. I use ChatGPT a lot. The context of my chat history is there. It's ready to be able to actually help with a prompt like this, draft an email. But let me show you what the pendant can do. I've been wearing the pendant every waking hour, basically, since for many, many months now. So every conversation I've had, every presentation I've made, every video I've done, it all is captured with the pendant. And so it's able to do something like this. It will draft an email, uses the fact that he invested in us 5 years ago. That's a great way to start. Hey, thanks for the money. It's been quite a journey. It gives you a quick update on and get some advice. Over the past few months, our team is working on our product, incorporating everything we've learned. Talks about how we've shipped the pendant now to 10,000 people. Can you believe that? 10,000 people across the world. And not only that, but as I shared recently, we've been through some ups and downs. We had a trough of sorrow recently where things weren't going well, but we've overcome that. Now we're in this beautiful venue with an amazing group of people, and we're ready to celebrate the fact that we've built something that people want. And so we talk about that in the email. This is the exact kind of email I would have written if I had the energy to time and write it down, but with the context of everything I've said, everything I've heard, AI can do this for me. And drafts are such a powerful mechanism to deliver this kind of value, because unlike agents, which are coming soon, drafts are something you can edit, you can tweak, you can change, you can iterate, and instead of starting with a blank piece of paper, which is a bit daunting, you start with something that you can tweak. You don't have to go from zero. You have something like this you can just edit, and this is actually, just as written, a perfect email. So that's great. It captures the emotional depth, it captures our journey. That's a really good example of how personalized AI with the context can help you. But it doesn't have to be as compelling as it could be pretty simple. Many of you, has anyone ever had to figure out, or Trader Joe's figuring out, what groceries should I buy? Anyone had that experience? Like, I swear there's something I need. Turns out, almost kind of by accident, by just capturing the conversations you have with your spouse, walking in, seeing that you've run out of oatmeal, you can see that our ability to just use that context to answer the question, what groceries should I buy, works pretty well. This is a real answer I got. I noticed that Jack ate a ton of green beans. It even noticed, hey, maybe you're out of green beans. Gives me the date. That's a great example of personalized AI. And you know, I think work is a great context. Shopping is another great context. For me personally, like I said at the beginning, the reason I'm here is my kids. The thing I get most from the pendant today are examples like this. I have 3 sons. Jack is my middle son. Anyone here a middle child? Anyone? If you're a middle child, you may not get the full attention the eldest or the youngest get. But Jack is a great kid. I spend quite a bit of time with him. And as a dad, there's always things I can do better. Here it's doing a great job of seeing our conversation I mentioned to him that he's a master builder. He's actually quite exceptional at Legos. He's doing an 18 and over piano right now, so not to brag about him, but here it's giving me example language. This is the thing I love about personalized AI. It gives you the language you can use. So it gives me a tangible way I can be a better dad for him. Talking about trading sugary rewards for meaningful choices, I thought Oreo bribes fine. I don't know, I don't mind it, but maybe spending more time with him would be a great reward for that. So this is one of the things I love about the Pendant. It can help you not just do your work, send emails faster, not just buy the right groceries, but it helps you be better. Anyone else have that experience? Yeah. All right, so one question we were curious about, as we went on this journey, we saw how much value, in many ways surprising value, that context of everything you've said and heard provided, was how much more valuable is this context? Isn't it enough to just have the chat history or maybe some saved memories? And we did an anonymous analysis of the questions people asked with our product. We want to know, how big is that line relative to the things you get today? And it turns out if you do this analysis, you just look at, hey, what are the kinds of questions that you need the context of everything you've said and heard to answer? And what are the questions that a simple facts or simple chat history might answer? And we were blown away by the results. We can answer 45 times as many prompts by using the context of the things you've said and heard. The ability to actually comprehensively capture those serendipitous moments, the things that you didn't think you might need, are exactly the kinds of pieces of information that are incredibly valuable for you using AI. So that was a great, really, really thrilled to see this. And many of you today are asking questions. We're learning from each other, asking questions you never imagined an AI model can answer, but if you power it with the context of your past, it can do incredible things. The other thing we look at, not just this analysis, we actually were kind of curious, how many people return this? And you may not notice, so 99.6%, this is the first time we've announced this number, 99.6% of people who bought the Pendant have kept it. That is a 0.4% return rate. For comparison, that's 3.5 times better than the iPhone. Sorry, Johnny. This blew me away. I mean, this is the first version of the product, and we were very, very pleased to see this. People love the Pendant. These metrics are great, but the stuff that really motivates me are the anecdotes. Many of you actually in this audience have posted publicly your joy of wearing the Pendant, the use cases, meeting other people in person wearing the Pendant. Has anyone had that moment the first time they met somebody else who wears a Pendant? Doesn't that feel amazing? You're part of a tribe and you're able to actually connect over this shared experience. And the folks out there are telling us over and over again they love the Pendant. We are so grateful. We know you have entrusted us to capture the information, sometimes most sensitive information in your lives. We really want to deliver and give you a product you love. So don't take my word for it. Love to welcome to the stage somebody who will talk to a few of you. This is my co-founder and good friend, Brett, who's going to come here. He's going to welcome several of you to the stage and share your perspective. Hear them from them, not from me, about everything they love about the Pendant. Please welcome Brett.
Thank you. Hi, oh, that's so sweet. Hi there, everyone. My name is Brett. I'm one of the co-founders over here at Limitless. And one of my favorite parts of my job is that I get to talk to a lot of you. Also, thank you to all of you who flew in. I know there's some of you that flew in like 5 hours, 10 hours, crazy amounts of time to be here. And that's really like the best part of my job. So out of everyone that I've chatted with so far over the past couple of years, the thing that really surprises me is how different the use cases are for the Pendant for given people. It's one thing to talk about the technology that we have up here on the stage, but my hope from today is that we can learn from each other about, not just what it does, but how it fits into those messy, meaningful, everyday sort of moments of life. So today I've invited 3 people to the event to share a little bit more about their story. Nothing scripted, it's sort of just a fireside chat, esque stories about how they're using the Pendant in their everyday life. So first up, we have Corinne. Love to welcome you to the stage, Corinne. Yes, and Corinne leads engineering for AI adoption at Babylist. So if you have a growing family in the room, you probably heard of them. She spent her career at the intersection of social media, startups, and software, but all really rooted in a deep curiosity for how technology shapes our relationships and our identity. So Corinne, you've been using the Pendant for a few months at this point. I'd love to hear a little bit about how your experience has been.
It's been excellent. I'm definitely in the 99.4% of people who love it. I've even convinced my husband to buy it. He was very skeptical at the beginning. So it's been amazing. I mean, I think for me personally, one of the reasons why I got it is because both of us are driving AI adoption at our companies. And it would literally get to the point where we had our voice memo app open. We're trying to record these conversations like on our walks at the kitchen table. And I'm like, there must possibly be a better solution out there. And that's how I found the Limitless. And I think from that initial use case, it's just been such an eye-opening experience. I feel like every week I come up with like a different way to use it, and it's become like deeply personal. I think I really resonated with this idea of like personalization. I do not trust the internet overlords. I do not think they know me. Facebook told me I was a 35-year-old male when I was in my 20s, and I've been working for a baby company for the last 5 years. So the internet also thinks I'm perpetually pregnant, even though I've never actually been pregnant. But Limitless knows that I'm not pregnant or that I'm not a 35-year-old male. So I think I have developed a level of trust with it, and it's been really interesting, like how my parents, my brother and sister-in-law, my in-laws react to it. We went to Germany for a family funeral about a month ago, and I had this conversation with my husband to be like, do you think they would let me record them? He's like, no. He's like, absolutely not. But the thing about like us being so far away and that we only go to Germany once or twice a year, and I did the math, right? They're in their 70s. We probably have like 20-ish trips left in terms of like being able to have experiences like meaningful. It's probably even less in terms of dementia runs in my husband's family. And the thing that I started to ask them about, because they're great storytellers, and this is in English, by the way, not in German, because I don't speak German, but they're great storytellers. And I was just like, wouldn't you want to capture these? Mm-hmm. Like the family oral history, they have a grandson now. And I was sort of like, wouldn't you want to capture this for him or for any children that we have? And that was actually the thing that got them to be like, oh, okay, yeah, turn that thing on. And I could convince my German in-laws to do that. I also discovered, it's not a translation app. It transcribes very reliably in German, but the summaries are in English. So I could actually sit there, with this app open, and I'm about 5 minutes behind the conversation, but I could completely follow what was going on, which is groundbreaking for me, because I've tried every translation app out there. I really need to learn German, so that's another story. But it was so profound, to be able to actually do this and to be in these group conversations. And it was actually through that, actually being in the summaries, every single moment, that I actually started to notice some really other interesting things about the app. There was this one moment that I think really actually shifted my mindset about Limitless and what it could do. A very small interaction between my nephew, who's about 1.5 years, his father, and his mother. And I'm reading through the app, and I come across a summary. It's something along the lines of, Timo is distressed because his father told him that there are monsters in the basement and his mother is in the basement. And I'm like, what? That is such a nuanced thing. And then I copied over the transcript in German into Google Translate to actually figure out what was said. And it's just it's this very subtle interaction where first, my brother-in-law tells him, oh, Timo, there are monsters in the basement. And then his mother walks down there. You can't actually hear that, but he screams mama, 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 right? It's a 1.5-year-old. They're not very sophisticated in their language. But then his father's pulling back to say oh no, Timo, it's okay. There aren't actually monsters in the basement. Mom is okay. But it's just this is a type of interaction that I feel most humans would miss. The subtlety of it is so, I studied a bit of linguistics and social linguistics in college, and that is so hard to do. Yeah. And I think it's just stuff like that that continues to just blow my mind about the product that you've created.
Yeah. Oh, thank you so much for sharing. I have a million follow-up questions. We only have a few minutes. I'm curious, if the pendant were to go away today, what's one thing that you would miss most about it?
Everything. I don't know. I mean, it really, I think, has changed a lot about how I show up in my life. I had a conversation with my husband to sort of say, we have to be accountable to like our therapist or our coach, but there's so much that you can like hide or just not say, right? In those interactions, if you like really don't want to like reveal yourself. But it's like, I am now accountable to my future self, and I like really like have to like look myself in the mirror in the things that I say, in the way that like as like our fights are playing out now, I'm like kind of like aware of that on some level, and I do actually think it changes how I show up in the interaction. And I think if I didn't have that anymore, maybe I would still do that, but it's different, and I like this idea of being accountable to my future self.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing. Really, really appreciate it. And also just to hear the, link between how you actually show up every single day and for that future self is like super helpful to hear. So thank you so much. Really appreciate you sharing.
Thank you.
Thank you. Awesome. Next, I'd like to invite up another person that's near and dear to our heart, Charles over here. Charles is the managing partner at Precursor Ventures, which is an early stage VC firm that's focused on investing in that institutional first round. He's invested over more than 375 companies, supported more than 400 founders, and was a founder himself prior to his days at Precursor. And he's been, our first user pretty much on every product. He's the first person we call up when we build something new. It's always Charles who got the first pendant off the batch. So thank you so much for all your support over the years. It's been really, really meaningful and really great to have you.
Thank you.
Yeah, well, I'd love to hear a little bit more about how you're using the pendant. I hear that's like a lot of work things for you, right?
It's funny. I totally relate to the family thing. I went back and looked at a summary. My son is 8, so a little older, and he taught me how to play a board game called, I don't know if anyone here has played Blockus. It's a really fun little board game. I didn't know how to play it. It was really cool to like watch the transcript of my son teaching me how to play a game I didn't know how to play. And that was one of those moments where I wouldn't have been able to recall that. And I think the biggest thing, so I'm a venture capitalist. I meet tons of entrepreneurs every day. They're broadly in 2 buckets. One bucket is people I already know, where I come into those meetings with context. The other bucket is people that I don't know. And for me, the thing I found that has the biggest impact on a meeting with a founder, whether I know them or not, is how present can I be in the meeting. And what I noticed before the pendant is my biggest worry was, what mechanism or crutch am I going to use to capture all the things that we talk about? Am I going to pull my phone out and do the, I promise you I'm not doing email, I'm just taking notes on my phone? No one believes that when a venture capitalist says that. Am I going to carry around a bunch of little field notebooks and a pen and hope that I can scribble it down? And I realized that all of those things were distracting from the ability to be present in a meeting. And I had an experience today that was like very emblematic of how I use the pendant. So one big shout out to the team. The pendant works amazingly outside. My office is 4 blocks from here. This part of San Francisco is very windy during the day. And a founder who is in my portfolio, but who makes angel investments on his own, we were looking at a company together, and he texted me, he goes, hey, I'm right outside your door. Are you free? I go, well, I'm always free either right now or in like 30 days. I happen to be free now. So let's go for a walk. And so I just walked out the door with my pendant on. And he's like, so what did you, I don't want to name the company. So what did you think of this founder? And we walked around Jackson Square for about 25 minutes, having a really like in-depth conversation, sharing our experiences about what it had been like to meet this founder. And I was able to like maintain eye contact with him while we walked in the wind with my pendant on, not having to worry about, am I going to have a good summary and recollection of this? And I think what made that meeting so great is that we were both able to be present and focused on the conversation. I didn't have to then run back to my office and try to do the quick brain dump. What did all the things we discussed? And then I just got like this really like hit me in the heart notification from my Limitless about the like, hey, I'm trying to get better at one thing. And I went yesterday to a welcome party for new people in my neighborhood. And the Limitless was like, hey, I've noticed that in social interactions, you always wait for other people to initiate the conversation before you jump in and offer. Maybe in the future, you could try being the person to, I was like, wait a minute, Limitless. I don't know if I, but I was like, that is actually that's an accurate observation you wouldn't get from me being in a single social. That's something you would accumulate over time from hearing me in many places. And on the work front, the other thing is I'm the only partner in my firm, and I go to a lot of talks, panels, events where I can't bring my team with me. And they always go, well, what did you talk about? And it's a lot better for me to say, these are all of the interactions I had at the conference. Let me click them all on the app and build a summary of my whole day that will talk about the highlights, pull out interesting quotes. And the summary I can produce with Limitless is far better than anything I could write from recall or by taking notes. So for me, it is like my like little super brain. And I can't wait till there's a day when everybody has a Limitless.
Oh, that's so sweet. Thank you so much for
Of
sharing your
course.
story. I really, really appreciate it. Especially the part about being present, like, resonates so much of, like, I feel like all the time I have, like, this taxing mental overload of, like, all the things I'm trying to keep track of in my head. And to hear how you say of just, like, it keeps you present in the moment. Super cool to hear.
I'll never forget when I first met Danny, he told me about perfect memory. And I'm like, that seems like an impossible, like this like nirvana concept. And like, I can see how it's going to happen now.
Yeah. Oh, thank you so much for sharing
Thank
more of
you,
your story. I
Brett.
appreciate it. Yes. Awesome. Last up, we have Josh over here. Josh is a father of 2, an entrepreneur, software developer. He owns a company called Martian Engineering, which is a boutique software development firm that's focused on applying AI to accelerate software development. And Josh, we've chatted before about how the Pendant, works for you. And one of the things that really stuck with me was the impact that it has, not just in work or in meetings or with your spouse, but really around the kids. So I'd love to hear a little bit more about how you've been using the Pendant for, your kids.
Yeah, totally. I bought it thinking I was just going to use it for work. That was like a year ago, a little more. And I when I got it in the mail, I think it was Easter weekend. I didn't put it on right away because it was Easter weekend. I wasn't working. And Easter Monday rolled around. I was taking the day off and thought, I think I'm just going to take this out and put it on and see what this is all about. And then I forgot about it all day. And we did the normal stuff, had the kids, and we took them to the playground, and we did the normal things, colored with my daughter, and ate meals, and dealt with tantrums, and all this normal stuff you do. They're like 1.5 and 3.5. And the next day, I got this notification about everything we did that day, and places where I got impatient and could have been more patient with my kids. And I thought, oh, shit, that's fair enough. And, I just started making it a morning ritual. I'd put it on, and most of the time when I work, I'm in an office by myself on a computer, and I have phone calls periodically throughout the day, but the most value I've gotten out of it is in the morning and in the evening when I'm home with my kids, and it captures all the little minutia throughout the day that happens. And, when you have small kids, their attention span's like 2 minutes long. And so you're jumping from thing to thing to thing. You're trying to clean the house and do all the stuff. And I'm trying to have a conversation with my wife, and I'm getting interrupted every 30 seconds. And, there's a lot of stuff that happens throughout the day that, goes in one ear, goes out. And then you forget about it. Well, there was a, funny connection I made because my grandma has been keeping a diary since 1987 every single day. And she watches my daughter every Friday. And she... a week or so after I got the Pendant, she sent me a text saying, I was rereading my diary from when you were Josie's age, and here's all the things that you did that are just like, what Josie does now. And I went, oh shit, I can have that. Because no parent has time to go and make a diary of everything they did. It's totally, and she was a grandmother at this point. She didn't have the time to do that when, she was a parent. And it just clicked into place. Like, I can capture every one of those little things. And I started asking it, what's a diary entry for, what did I do yesterday? And it can just give me this whole list of all the fun little things I did with my kids. She's really into rainbows. That's her favorite color, rainbow color. And she wants rainbow fish and rainbow circles and rainbow trees and rainbow flowers and rainbow everything all the time. And it captures all these little moments where I'm coloring with her. And I'm, Easter happened recently, and little kids love egg hunts. And so we do egg hunts several times every single day. They train all year long. So it captures all these moments that we do egg hunts, and how my daughter wakes me up asking for chocolate because that's the way that we bribe her to not wake me up in the middle of the night, which works. And so all these little minutia of daily life with kids are captured, and I can recall it all and go through it. And photos can't do that. Photos are great, and we have tons of pictures of our kids, but they don't capture the dialogue and, the fact that my youngest has eczema, and I went into she was taking a bath and she was itching, and I said, oh, you're itchy. And she went, itchy. And it was like one of her first words. She's 15 months old. And she was just saying, itchy, itchy, itchy. And it captured that. And it remembers that, it was probably 6:30 p.m. on the 27th. She said the word itchy. And so I have all these little moments now at my disposal.
Yeah, I love that. And I think that we are just a summation of all those small little moments in life too. So it's cool that you have that. Thank you so much for sharing. Really, really appreciate you a lot. And also the travel that everyone made to be here. So thank you so much.
You bet.
Yeah, so you know what I love is like how all those different stories, they're just so different, right? And how it shows up for each individual person. And I think the real power of the Pennant isn't in the tech itself, but you know, it's in the ways that it really shows up to support us and help us connect better. So that's what we're trying to build towards, right? A world where you can be the best version of yourself and feel supported along the way. So from these stories, you heard a little bit about where we're currently at. I'd love to turn it back over to Dan to talk a little bit more about where we're headed.
Thank you very much, Brett. All right. What a perfect segue to what we're going to talk about next. And Charles, thank you for remembering perfect memory. That was a bit ironic, but you remembered perfect memory. That has been something I've been thinking about for a long time. And Josh, your input at our last retreat actually inspired a lot of what I'm going to talk about. So it's great to have folks, work with us in building in public and getting your input and feedback. So I'll share what I've said before, which I think some of you might have seen, some of you might not, which inspired what comes next. 90% of memories are forgotten after 7 days. It follows what's called the forgetting curve. As time goes on, the things you experience, you just naturally forget. This gets worse. An earlier speaker mentioned as you get older, your memory tends to fade. People's memory actually peak when they're 20 years old on average, and then every year thereafter, your memory gets a little bit worse. One person just cursed, in case you didn't hear that. And so what do? How do we cope? Well, we do this. Some of us do this thing called to-do lists. I'm a bit embarrassed to admit this in front of this group in particular. This is a very high productivity, high impact group, but I'll admit this right now. I don't use a to-do list. It's just too much work. And the best system I've come up with is mark unread. Anyone else? Is this their to-do list? Yeah, a lot of hands. So I do mark unread because I see something and I'm like, oh shoot, I probably should do something with that. I don't want to do that right now. So instead of actually dealing with it or putting in a list, I make the future version of myself a little bit annoyed, and I just mark it as unread, hoping that the future version of myself has some time at some point, maybe they're going to get to it. What I like about this is that it's 2 taps. 2 taps on my phone and Slack, 2 clicks on my computer. But what's better than 2 taps? 1 tap, right? Well, what's better than 1 tap? 0 taps. What if reminders were automatic? So today, you'll see soon that there's 2 tabs at the bottom of the Limitless app. There's your life log, the comprehensive summaries of the things that you've said and heard. There's your settings. And we're going to add a new tab. Reminders. These are automatic reminders that from your day based on the conversations you have. And several of you have inspired this, Josh being one of them. And I want to show you a live demo of this idea. So here is my phone. This is connected to the TV here. You can see, actually, let's see how it's done. This is a transcript. Yeah, Charles, a venture capitalist, discussed using the Pennant. Great, it's captured everything so far. Good. You see it's real. This just happened. And here is the new tab, Reminders. Reminders are automatic. You don't have to add them. They use the context of your conversations to come up with things that we suggest might be things you want to do. They're automatically organized by category. So here's my work reminders. These are conversations I had wearing the Pennant without any work. Things like reevaluate, ask AI, and life log feedback, add content. We had this one-off conversation at the end of our team meeting where I mentioned, hey, we got a lot of people really excited. We got HIPAA compliance coming soon. We should probably add content around healthcare providers. It pulled that thread out, which was a good idea in the moment, but would have disappeared in the 90% we forget after a week. Added it to my list. If I wanted to do that, I just tap it, and now it's on my to-do list. I've made it an active to-do. Or personal, I'm building a treehouse, so I gotta get a drill bit, a specific size of a drill bit. Well, how are you gonna remember that? Or very commonly, groceries. Groceries are a thing. Oftentimes you're collaborating, you're going and actually, with my show, I showed earlier that example of Ask AI, where just through the content of the conversation, I know that we ran out. And so, I look at that maybe at the end of the night, you go to bed, you're like, hey, what was the day? What did I have to do today? You look at this list, yes, oatmeal. You accept it, you hit plus, and it shows up on your list of things to do. You go to the store later at Trader Joe's, you pull out your list, here are the things, oatmeal. And watch, when you accept and you actually achieve a task or a reminder, wouldn't it be great if it did something like this? Beautiful confetti, positive reinforcement, you're doing a good job, you're following up on your reminders, and it disappears. These are the basic lists that will give you, out of the box, work, personal, groceries. But what I'm even more excited about is leveraging the fact that all of you live and work and do different things. You all have your own priorities. Why not let you add your own list? And this list is not just a simple list that you have to manually curate. Like I said, 0 taps. You now can create a list of things like books to read. You give it a description in human language. That language is then used by the LLM to decide, does something throughout the day qualify? Maybe you're really into sci-fi movies. So you create a list of movies to watch that are sci-fi. And maybe you're at a dinner party and somebody mentions a great sci-fi movie. Now it shows up on the list that you've created. So you can organize your life automatically. You set up these lists. We give you some great defaults. And you never have to forget anything again. What do you think? So that's reminders. It's going to help make your life much easier. Take the things throughout the day that you would be saying and capture them for you automatically. All right. Now, obviously reminders being automatic is great, but what if you wanted to remember more than just what you've said and heard? I showed earlier this graph where the x dimension is the intelligence of the underlying system, the y dimension is the personalization. What if you wanted to do more? If you want to go beyond just what you've said and heard? We think the future of personalized AI includes everything you've read and written. Many of you were big fans of a product we made called Rewind. It's a Mac app that captures your screen. We're now taking the things we loved and you all love about that, and we're going to take the capturing of your screen and take the things you've read and written and add it to this amazing context that the AI system has to give you a personalized AI. And we did some math. We actually did some basic analysis asking, well, how much impact is this compared to chat history? And actually, if you break it down in every single day, you're probably asking maybe one ChatGPT question. You've got about 700 words of chat history, but you're also saying a lot. You say about 50,000 words, and you're saying and hearing 50,000 words. You're writing and reading 43,000 words. What if you could capture that every day? And imagine that compounding over days, weeks, months, years. Everything you've said, everything you've heard, everything you've read, and everything you've written is an amazing, amazing set of context. So that's where we're going. We're going to capture not just what you've said and heard, but everything you've read and written. Okay, so let's talk about some use cases. What's this going to enable? Well, let's talk about some basic stuff. We all know that large language models today can do high school writing, maybe gets a bit smarter PhD writing. It's not crazy to imagine new science, being able to do some really innovative things there. You see some early examples of this. I talked about what it means to climb this other dimension, the personalization dimension, maybe drafting emails just like me. Or wouldn't it be great if the model and the product could just do the boring half of your job for you? So much of our work day to day is mundane, monotonous, but you have some skill, some experience in doing it. A model that captures what you say and everything you hear, and everything you read, everything you write, they can do this for you. They take the boring parts of your job and automate it away. And you using AI can be so much more productive, so much more purposeful. Spend the time on things you love, not the drudgery, the parts of their job that an AI can do for you. And going beyond that, why not agentic behavior? Once you go beyond drafts where you've kind of learned what works and what doesn't work, the AI should do and could do things for you just the way you would have. And that's the true power of a personalized AI, is leveraging the context of your past and giving you this superpower of agentic behavior identical to you. So some of you, you're excited, you're nodding, you see, but what we're going to talk about today, like I told you at the beginning, is going beyond this. We're going to take this to 11. We're going to go to crazy town here. And I'm actually going to talk about what the true future of personalized AI might look like. And it's so crazy I had to shrink everything down to the corner here to really show you how far this impossible vision of the future might look. And to do that, I want to talk about a couple concepts. First, let's talk about this sort of intelligence dimension. And before I get to the specifics on that, I want to prime you here with just the basic idea that the impossible seems impossible until it doesn't. And I'll give you some examples. One is, this is something that I think went viral recently, but there's a quote in the New York Times in 1903, October 9th, you should remember that. The flying machine is 1 million or even 10 million years away from us. This was before, obviously, 69 days later. Orville Wright completed the first heavier than air approach to flying. So this was just 69 days later, in the same year that something that once thought was impossible and published in the New York Times is now clearly possible. Another example. This is Lee DeForest. He's called the father of radio. He said, man will never reach the moon regardless of all future scientific advances. And you should be careful using this phrase. Never say all scientific advances, because there are going to be a lot of them. And just 12 years later, we were on the moon. More recently, the impossible seems impossible until it doesn't. This is a great scientist, Professor Dame Janet Thornton. She said protein folding is a problem that I was beginning to think would not get solved in my lifetime. In that same year, an amazing team at DeepMind built AlphaFold, which can predict how proteins fold into 3D shapes, fundamental to understanding biology, just in the same year. So hopefully I've set the stage for something that might seem crazy, but I think is going to happen, which is that machines are going to become conscious. So let's talk about consciousness. Consciousness is a spectrum, and I'll just share some intuition for why I think that's true. If you think about different organisms in the world, you've got bacteria, insects, mice, dogs, humans, and clearly humans are quite conscious. I have a subjective experience of living and standing in this room. I assume many of you do too, although I don't know for sure. I think many of you are conscious. And on the other extreme, bacteria. Many of you probably wash your hands. I hope you wash your hands pretty regularly. You're killing lots of bacteria, and you don't feel bad about it. And I think a reason why is that you know that they probably don't have much objective experience. You're not causing the bacteria suffering. But a spectrum in the middle, obviously, as you get closer and closer to what we think of as conscious beings, you feel guilt that you're causing suffering to something that has subjective experience. So that's my argument that consciousness is a spectrum. We have this innate sense that we won't want to harm or cause suffering to anything that has a subjective experience. So then what is consciousness in one sentence? Well, it's the subjective experience of observing oneself. I think this is best described in Douglas Hofstadter's book, I Am a Strange Loop, where he says your mind's essence is a self-referential loop. Basically, the brain looking at itself. A great illustration I love is this is a drawing. This is called Drawing Hands by M.C. Escher. My grandfather actually, who's also Dutch, had this up in his house, and I grew up every summer visiting him and seeing this Drawing Hands. Didn't think it would ever come back to me many years later, but here it is. And this is a great illustration of the concept of consciousness, of this idea of a self-referential loop, of a hand drawing itself, which is drawing itself. So I would pose the question, if consciousness is a spectrum, could machines become conscious? Well, human consciousness likely gradually arose as our brains evolved more neurons and complex feedback loops. Like, it helps you survive, to kind of know what's going on, have the sense of self. In fact, many of us parents, that babies, when they're born, they're not fully self-aware. It takes many years for them to develop and for the brain to develop and organize and start reflecting on itself. And similarly, an AI that increases in complexity and introspective capability might cross the threshold where there's a genuine strange loop of consciousness. At first like an insect and eventually like a human. Well, so then what creates this consciousness? Sebastian Sung, a Princeton neuroscientist, wrote a great book called Connectome, and the thesis of the book is that our brain's wiring makes us who we are. And he has this great visual metaphor. He talks about the brain is very much like, or the wiring of the brain is very much like the riverbed in a stream, where as we go through our lives, most of the neural activity follows this riverbed. It's the water that goes into the stream. But also over time, the water itself affects the stream. It affects the shape the riverbed takes. So our connectome, the comprehensive set of connections in our brain, adapts, it changes, it evolves as we change, adapt, and evolve. And so I would argue that what makes you is that wiring diagram. It's the connections in your brain. And so let me give you some intuition for this. Let me show you a great visual here of what it would take if you took your brain and sort of sliced it up and decided you wanted to maybe look at that map. So this is slicing brain tissue. This is Bobby Casturi holding a cell, a bunch of brain tissue zooming in 100,000 times. This is Daniel Berger who made this video. This is Jeff Lichtman's lab at Harvard. This is the slices of a mouse brain reconstructed into that wiring diagram, exploded and refined into something that you can imagine. This is a visualization of what's going on in your brain. This is a mouse brain, but your brain is very similar. And it's an amazing web of connections that create this emergent property of what we call consciousness. Now, there's a difference between this and what's actually going on in your brain. It's a small little problem, which is the problem of scale. This is about 1 trillion times smaller. That what I showed you is 1 trillion times smaller than the human brain. This is actually what got me excited about this field. Is in 2015, I saw this paper and this work and got me very excited about this idea of what makes us us and the wiring diagram in our connectomes. So if you'll indulge me, let's do a little thought experiment, because I think some of these ideas are kind of crazy and, like I said, may be hard the first time you hear them. Let's talk about your brain. So this is what you've got in your skull. I'll give you some basic facts. It's got about 86 billion neurons, about 10 to the 14 trillion synapses. That's the connections between your neurons. Sebastian Sung says you are your connectome, which is these connections, the network of connections, the neural activity that occurs in them. So let's do a little experiment. This is a visualization of those connections. You have quite a few more neurons than this, but let's just use this for argument's sake. And I want to ask you a very simple question. This is going to start easy and may get a little bit more challenging. So the first question I hope is easy. My question is simple. What makes you you? So last night, this is kind of what your connectome might have looked like. This morning, after a period of not being conscious, your brain looked almost identical. This is this morning. And I'll just ask this group by a show of hands, did you feel like you were the same you this morning as you did last night? Yeah, seems like everyone. If you did not, let's just talk after, because I worried about you. But ideally, most of you wake up in the morning thinking, boy, I'm the same person I was just last night. This is not a trick question, by the way. This is supposed to be the easy one. So yeah, you were the same person this morning as you were last night. Okay. Now, let me tell you a fact. So one of your neurons, just a single neuron, swaps out tens of trillions of atoms in its molecular machinery every night. And you have 86 billion of these. Like, the insides of each of these neurons are constantly changing. I'll ask you the same question. Knowing this fact, does that change anyone's opinion? You still kind of feel like the same you, right? By a show of hands. How many of you feel like the same you in the morning as you did the night before? Okay. Keep your hands up now, okay? We're going to do a couple experiments. So keep your hand up and put your hand down as soon as you feel like this is no longer you, okay? Let's say there's this hypothetical surgery. You replace just one neuron. 1 out of 86 billion. You go in there, perfectly replace this little tissue in your brain with a digital neuron. A neuron that acts identically to the first one. Anyone think that after just one neuron gets replaced, you're no longer you? No, everyone's hand still up. Okay, 2 neurons. The second neuron. You go in and get it's a painful surgery. You do that, you get the second neuron. Okay, everyone's hand still up. What about half of them? Okay, okay, you gradually replace. We've got a couple people who most people still think that they're still them. Okay. What about eventually you replace all the neurons? The connectome is exactly the same. It just happens to be a different medium, just like the molecular data is different. Okay, many of you still have your hands up saying after gradually replacing all your neurons. Now I ask you, now you've seen the before and after. There's the blue cyan on the right and the before. What if you just replace all your neurons in one surgery? It's the same before and after. How many think you're the same person? Okay, I lost a couple people. Okay. Some people agree. So I think the takeaway here that I'm trying to illustrate with this thought experiment, if you think about gradual replacement of your brain, and certainly hopefully if you think you're the same you after gradual replacement, and the before and after are the same, then the takeaway might be simply that what makes you you is your connectome. It's not the physical stuff, it's the connections. And if your connectome can be emulated, you can be emulated. And so this crazy far-right idea, I think, is the future of personalized AI is mind emulation. What is mind emulation? It's a conscious system that behaves identically as your original mind and feels like you. One day you'll go to sleep biologically and you'll wake up digitally. What might that look like? What are some embodied versions of mind emulation? Well, initially it'll just be some system in the cloud that has subjective experiences, or at least we think it does. That's the goal, is it has a subjective sense of self, but probably kind of bored, not interacting much with the world. Maybe the simplest interaction with your embodied mind emulation might be by text. You could chat with this version. Maybe your grandkids could talk to you. Your biological body's not here, but they can talk to your emulated mind. And you have that subjective experience of interacting with them. Or maybe it's voice. Maybe there's a device where you can talk to somebody via voice. Or even further down, maybe they're embodied robotically, somebody who can walk around the world, and the senses of the robot and the actuators replicate the same physical meat that they once had on their arms and legs, but now are connected to their connectome the same way that once their biological system was. So now I think often some people might immediately say, okay, this is pretty cool, I get it, I know why I would want that. But I'll just answer very concretely, why emulate a mind? And to me, it's pretty simple. Life is precious. I started this talk by telling you why I'm here. These 3 guys. I'm here because of them. I want them to live in a world in the future where they can choose when to die, when they're ready, not when disease strikes them prematurely. What makes us us shouldn't disappear when our bodies do. So that's why I'm here. And now, how would you do this? Okay. This is hard. This is maybe one of the hardest things we've ever done, so I don't exactly know how we're going to do, but I'll tell you about 3 key ingredients I think we're going to need if one day we're going to emulate a mind. think you kind of need the brain map. I think those connectomes, the connections are kind of important. We talked about that. I think you need cheap compute. Like, our brains are pretty amazing for for what it does with just a few watts of power. We're going to need a world where cheap compute exists. And last, I think we need behavior data. Data that can help us understand how that connectome works. Let's talk about each one. So brain map and cheap compute, good news on this front, actually. So I don't know if you've been paying attention, but this amazing trend, but the calculations per second for $1,000, just $1,000 in, how many calculations per second you can get, that has been growing exponentially. You'll see here the y dimension is logarithmic, and you'll see that has been growing exponentially. And we're on pace to reach the what many people think is the calculation capacity of a human brain. We'll achieve that in the year 2047. So that's amazing in and of itself. But just compute power isn't enough. What about the connectome? Well, there's lots of researchers out there, some folks in this room, who are focused on mapping brains, mapping connectomes. And the progress there has been amazing. The first brain that was emulated was a small organism called C. elegans. That was 1986, I believe. That's a first blue dot there. And the most recent advances have been staggering. And if you just trend those most recent advances, we will be able to actually map a human-sized brain in the year 2040. So within our lifetimes, this is possible. Now, the last part is partly why we're doing what we're doing today, which is behavior data. And you could argue, okay, Dan, didn't you just say I am my connectome? Why would I need behavior data? Just take the wiring diagram and hit play. Well, interestingly enough, a great study was done where they actually asked a bunch of neuroscientists, could they understand a microprocessor by just scanning it the same way I was just talking about? They took an old Atari chip, they gave it a bunch of neuroscientists and said, go at it, use your techniques. And they did what I was showing about, a little less fancy maybe than slicing it into electron microscopes, but they looked at it, and it turns out it's really hard to do this without being able to play the Atari. This is an Atari chip. You need to understand how it works, the dynamics of the system. And so I would argue that at least for the first bunch of mind emulations, you're going to need some behavior data for that particular individual to emulate them sufficiently well. You know what kind of behavior data? This kind. Everything you've read and written, everything you've said and heard. And you know what would be great is if you had a device you could wear that could do that. And so this is, in many ways, why I started this company. The ability for us to one day, hopefully, capture the things that, while we're still alive, might be useful down the line. And certainly maybe not for us, but for our kids. So those are the ingredients. That's the crazy journey I told you about would take on. I hope I brought some of you with me. I'll give an analogy, because some folks think this is so audacious. I'll just give an analogy of something that also once thought was audacious, which is SpaceX. You know, they say they're going to Mars. I think they believe that. But along the way, they've had to do things like Starlink. You got to build a great product. You got to build a great business. You got to earn the revenue. You got to build something valuable in the world. And that's our pendant. It's something that we think will create a lot of value in the world in the short term. I think that's amazing. We're changing lives for the better. But long term, really long term, the data we're collecting, I think, can be very valuable for the mission of emulating a human mind. If that's exciting, and I see lots of smiles, I hope it is, we are hiring across the board. Go to limitless.ai/careers. If you're watching this video online, head over there right now. We've got a lot of amazing roles we've never talked about before until today, that will help us pursue this long-term vision, and we think will be really amazing and a huge impact on the world, and hopefully not just for us, but for our kids as well. So I'll end where I started, which is I want to thank you. I want to thank you for starting this journey with us. I hope I didn't lose anyone along the way here. I want to thank you for wearing a pendant, advocating and using this technology to help your lives be better. And I want to end by sharing maybe a meaning that you didn't interpret the first time. Many of you are wearers of the pendant, and this is a great tweet somebody put out there, which is they showed this little card, and if you got a pendant, you got this as well. This is a little card that we put in the box. It says, "Go beyond" on one side, and on the other side, we say, "Our vision is to free the human mind from its biological limitations." See what we did there? It's a deeper meaning. And I'll end by just saying what this card says, which is, if you believe technology can augment our capabilities in ways we never imagined, we're building for you. Thank you.